Okay, good afternoon, everyone. This is Rajesh Chabra in Singapore. I'm Managing Director of CSR Works International. So very warm welcome to this workshop, the 2020 CSA DJSI results. And we are going to start the session very soon. And I am here to introduce our fantastic panelists and speakers for this workshop. And I would like to, you see on screen, they're already on the screen smiling. And it's Sebastian Senner and Lim Adriansen. Both of them, they are senior ESG benchmarking specialists. And the special thing about them is that they have joined us from Switzerland. So you can see it's cold there and they're enjoying their coffee perhaps. And then we have Eric Cristianto. He is from our hometown in Singapore, and he is Director ESG Services Specialist Products here with S&P Global. So I'm going to hand over to them to start the workshop. And another, in terms of the housekeeping, you will see that there is a Q&A box, and you can send your questions through that. We'll keep an eye on the questions, and towards the end, we will try to answer as many questions as possible. So I'll just sit back and enjoy the workshop. Over to you, Sebastian.
Thank you, Rajesh, and also hi from my side, from Zurich. As you can see, we're still working from home, Lim and I, but we're making the best out of it, I'd say. It's a great pleasure to be here today to present the 2020 CSA DJSI results with a specific focus on Southeast Asian countries. We would have loved to be there, of course, in person last year. Some of you might remember we were actually able to come to Singapore for a whole week to discuss and to present the methodology in much more detail, to have, say, in-person workshops. So this is not possible this year, but as I said, I think we all got used to this new reality. And what's positive is that, you know, we see that some countries, Singapore is among them, are able to manage this pandemic well, and so there is some light at the end of the tunnel, and hopefully, yeah, Switzerland will be able to manage soon. So what are we going to talk about today in this session? We're going to, of course, look at the new DJSI results, as I said, with a specific focus on Southeast Asia. We're going to look at how companies have performed in the region. We're going to look at how, say, participation rates in the CSA have evolved. Then we're going to, in a second step, we're going to look at the new questions and the topics that have been introduced in 2020. So there we're gonna have a more in-depth session on IT security as well as on packaging, questions that have been revised this year. In a third step, we're going to look at the benefits of participating in the CSA. So we're going to look at how you as a sustainability manager or as a, say, investors relation person can use the results and also the insights that you get from the CSA internally as well as externally. We're going to talk about some tips and tricks, what to consider when filling in the CSA. And then last but not least, it's a pleasure to hand it over to Eric Cristianto from S&P Global, based in Singapore, our local representative, so to speak, who will talk about the ESG evaluation, which is a service that can take your CSA scores to the next level. And as Rajesh has already mentioned, at the end we'll have a Q&A session. So please don't be shy. Submit your questions, and we'll be happy to address them towards the end of this webcast.
Thank you very much, Rajesh and Sebastian, for the introduction. Also from my side, very happy to be back virtually. I was also very happy to be in Singapore last year to do this in person and do it in a more lengthy way, but that's what has to happen these days. So we'll make the best out of it, and hopefully you get as much insights as you might have gotten out of our in-person discussions. So I'm going into performance. I will talk a bit about transparency, why that is important, and then on some additional resources that you can find information on understanding the participation better, but also understanding the CSA in general. And then immediately into the first slide, which shows already some great news that we can share from our side, is that we got a record climb in CSA participation. You can see the participation over the last 20 years or almost 21 years. We have been doing this for a very long time. And we had gradual increase in participating companies that was converging with the gradual increase in ESG interest, of course, and also with the amazing increase in ESG interest in general. We saw that translated into a huge increase in CSA participation. There was 19% more companies actively participating in our assessment. The assessment is very elaborate, so we cover all aspects of ESG. So the fact that companies take the time to actively participate, fill out the questionnaire, gather all the data is really a big achievement for all these companies. This is the 1,386 companies that actively participate. They are part of a universe of companies that we invite to participate in the corporate sustainability assessment. And we invite them because they are eligible for the Dow Jones Sustainability Index. You can be eligible for the impact index if you're part of these 3,467 companies. That is based on your free float market cap. If you're in the top 10%, top 20% for regional indices, then you can be in the DJSI. But this is only about participation, not about index inclusion. We have an overall participation rate in the DJSI universe of 40%, which is very good. We have 15 industries where there's almost more than half of the companies worldwide are participating in our assessment. And interesting to know, the corporate sustainability assessment is covering 61 industries. So we have industry-specific questionnaires, which I will also address in the third part when I'm talking about benefits of participation in the CSA. So these were the general numbers, now we go into regional participation for 2020, and you can immediately see that Asia Pacific is doing a really good job. From the 1,386 companies that participate, 36% come from Asia Pacific. And you can see that also the increase in participation is exactly the same in Asia Pacific as we see as a general increase. The increase in Latin America is a bit lower than the other regions, but that is due to them already having a very high participation rate percentage-wise. In absolute score, there's unfortunately less big companies there, but they already had a very high percentage of participation. And actually Asia Pacific is leading the pack in participation rate. And we can also see that in the Southeast Asian market, where there's also a very high participation rate, which I didn't specifically highlight in this slide, but we can see that. If we then go into the actual performance benchmarking within Southeast Asia, we will be benchmarking with industry or geographical peer groups, which facilitates the identification and understanding of gaps and areas where you want to take action. So even if it's not about your assessment specifically, the fact that you can compare yourself within the industry or within your geography helps you to understand your own assessment, of course. It helps you to internally communicate and to seek solutions. It helps you to define reasonable and credible targets, because it doesn't, we are always scoring on a scale from 0 to 100. It's an absolute scale, and that is referencing our expectations. But you cannot always score 100, not even the best companies score 100. So it's always good to understand how other companies are scoring to put a reasonable target of where you want to be. And then obviously will help you improve reporting and communicate the process to make it more focused around material topics. And then let's dive into the Southeast Asia participation. This is the participation rate by country and for Southeast Asian companies. And this you see the 2018, 19, and 20 participation. Indonesia has a slightly small participation rate, but there's also not that many companies invited, and you see that they're starting with that. Thailand, on the other hand, has been a very strong participator for the last few years, and you will also see that in their actual scores, that's quite developed country in relative to ESG. And you can see that by the fact that they have been participating for a long time, so they know the process, they know what is important on ESG materiality. This is percentage-wise. You can also see it in absolute numbers, where you again see that Indonesia is a rather small market, and Thailand is quite a big market with a lot of companies participating there, and also very easy to compare yourself then against a bigger peer group. Looking at the absolute scores, we see that Indonesia is not lacking actually. And also that Asia Pacific is in the middle of the pack. If you look at the world average total scores for participating companies, and this is for participating companies, just to highlight, we have both companies that actively participate and companies that are being assessed only based on publicly available information. If you actively participate, you most of the time get a slightly higher score than if you're only assessed on publicly available information. You see that the world the average is around 56. Asia Pacific region is doing a bit better. Europe has always been leading the pack with higher scores, but Asia Pacific is in the medium. And then if you look at Asia Pacific specifically and at the Southeast Asian companies, there I was already mentioning before that Indonesia is starting. So you see that the scores are a bit on the lower side, but Thailand, who have seen a lot of companies participating, a lot of companies that can compare themselves or were already benchmarking themselves against their peers, you also see that reflected in very, very high scores. You can compare yourself against your peers, against regions, but you can also compare yourself against other industries or within your industry. There you also see a very big difference. This is the largest sectors where we see both the world score, the Asia Pacific score, and the Southeast Asia score. Southeast Asia has been consistently outperforming in almost all industries the world and Asia Pacific score. And you see that in energy and materials and telecommunication services, they are doing really well. If you go into transparency, this is a very interesting part because then you can see how your stakeholders perceive from your sustainability strategy. And we have two different indicators: the degree of transparency, which is the percentage of applicable questions for which you have at least some public information available, and then the transparency score that shows your average score on all applicable questions that require publicly available information. So one is, do you have information? And the other one is, how do you score on these public questions? And we will give a quick example of risk culture, which is a very important topic that is rarely disclosed in the public domain. Here you can see that the degree of transparency has been declining over the years in general. This has mostly to do with the increase in participation rate. So more new companies are joining, so therefore the average degree of transparency is going a bit down because new companies mostly have less publicly available information. Asia Pacific is a bit behind on the rest of the world. Obviously Europe is increasing, but also behind the world averages there. If you look at the transparency score, we see unfortunately the same trend where the scores are decreasing. Again, that is due to new participation, but also Asia Pacific is lagging a bit behind the rest of the world here. So that is a bit of room for improvement and something you can focus on in your region. If we then go to specifically showing the difference between an average score of companies that are answering and of companies where we assess them only based on publicly available information, we see in the total score, there's a huge difference. In the world, companies that actively participate, they score 56. If you're only scored based on publicly available information, you mostly score lower. This is also what we expect, because companies that participate most of the time, they're more actively engaged in ESG and they have more, so therefore they also have more publicly available. Asia Pacific, the difference is even larger. If you look at the example of risk culture in the risk culture question, where we assess the tools of financial, where we consider, for example, financial incentives that incorporate risk metrics for senior executives or line managers, or where we look for other means to promote a risk culture in that question. We see a huge difference on a question level, where there's almost no information publicly available. So it becomes very interesting for us and for the investor community to understand these underreported non-financial aspects. And by answering the questionnaire, you can share that information even when it's still internally, when it's still used internally, for example. I also want to show you that there are some additional sources where you can find information. We have some amazing interactive presentations online. I will quickly show you, but not go into too much detail. For example, if you look at DJSI participation, and I hope you can still see my screen. This is a very nice interactive presentation that also explains how the CSA is set up. The fact that we have a total score, we have dimension scores, we have criterion scores, we have questions, and we gather around 1,000 data points that roll up into these 100 questions, into the 22 criteria, into the 3 dimensions, and into this single CSA score, which is equivalent to the S&P Global ESG score. And you can also go in more detail on the participation. We already seen that, but there's also a very nice slide on the Asia Pacific region, where the participation rate is 36%, and you can hover over, zoom into specific countries and see how they are performing, both in 2019 and 2020. A very valuable interactive tool, we believe. I'm not going into detail. I invite you to go into these interactive presentations yourself and do your own research. And then as a last point, I want to highlight the DJSI industry leader reports. For every industry, so for 61 industries, we make an industry leader report. You can find it in the same location as these interactive presentations. And this gives you information on who the industry leader is, what the 2020 industry assessment results are, which you can see on the left side, and you can see the leader's performance there. But more importantly, you can find the industry drivers, which give you a very good indication of what the industry materiality is according to S&P Global. And the most relevant criteria in each sustainability dimension based on the weight and the relative importance in that industry at this moment. And that is my part, and I'm very happy to then hand over to Sebastian, who will go into a bit more detail on the methodology review.
So thank you, Lim, for these insights. It's encouraging to see that companies from the region are actively engaging, and they're doing this at an increasing level. And it's also great to see that you know, as a whole, Asia Pacific is scoring relatively well, much higher than other regions. So that's definitely great to see. In this second part, I would like to talk about the new questions and topics that have been introduced in the CSA this year. And we're again going to look at how companies from the region have performed on those. As Lim has mentioned, the CSA is a yearly evaluation of companies' ESG performance. And in order to keep this evaluation relevant, we do update the CSA from time to time. So this happens on a regular basis, and I'd say per year, about up to 10% of the CSA content can actually change compared to last year. So why do we do it? First of all, of course, we have to be on top of all the upcoming trends in the ESG space. There's a lot of development going on, and we want to ensure that these topics are reflected in our analysis. And of course, second of all, we want to be able to differentiate between the different companies. On one hand, on the top end among the high performers, but also on, say, the lower ends on the CSA beginners, or, you know, for the companies that have just started their journey in this area. This is all, of course, to integrate our concept of financial materiality. So for each question that we're introducing or that we're updating, we ask ourselves, are there any signals in there, or is this information relevant for to see, or is it capturing ESG information that ultimately can have an effect on a company's financial performance? So this is very much integrated in our methodology updates. On this slide, you can see that these developments basically rely on 4 pillars. On one hand, we have the in-house expertise coming, you know, from an investment management background. Sam has a lot of industry experts as well as topic experts that follow these trends and are able to integrate them into the survey. The second pillar, and I cannot stress how important that is direct feedback from companies. So there's many examples for questions that have been adjusted or new topics that have been introduced based on company feedback. We have a dedicated section in the CSA, so all companies that fill in the CSA, they can also provide feedback directly through the CSA, tell us what they liked, what they didn't like, where they think some improvement might be needed, and that's very valuable. To have this, to integrate this. We also work with external parties, so we have collaborations in place. You see a few names there, and this is of course also to align the expectations that we have, and to make sure that companies, you know, can also in some way streamline their reporting efforts. And I'm sure this topic will also be addressed by the summit that is taking place tomorrow, and I'm sure Rajesh will have loads to say about this issue. Last but not least, investor feedback. As I said, we have an investor's background, and now that we're part of S&P Global, we even get more feedback from all different kinds of investors that have direct access to the CSA scores through our market intelligence platforms, in ExpressFeed, to give you an example, and of course our index clients, which have been relying on the DJSI for many years. So let's look at the major methodology developments in 2020. You see a short overview here of the 3 dimensions. Blue, governance in the economic dimension, where we've updated our questions on privacy protection, innovation management, and sustainable finance. And We've also revisited the criterion on information security, cybersecurity, and system availability, and I'm going to go into a bit more detail on that one. In the environmental dimension, we've updated product stewardship, GMOs, and packaging. And in the social dimension, we've updated the question and the criterion about addressing the cost burden. So you see the names already give it away to some extent. A lot of these criteria are quite industry specific. So for example, addressing the cost burden is something that applies to the biotechnology companies and the pharmaceutical companies specifically. So many of you probably have not come across these questions. Same goes for GMOs, of course, product stewardship, the same. So therefore, I'd like to focus on two areas, packaging, which I think everyone can relate to. It currently applies to 12 industries, and we have completely revisited this criterion. So there's a lot of new aspects to cover. And I would also like to talk about information security, cybersecurity, a criterion that we've had for a long time, of course, but which, as of this year, applies to all 61 industries. So basically all companies now have to address this topic, as we believe it's become increasingly important for all companies. And in order to talk about this area in a bit more detail, I'd like to introduce you to this concept, which is very much aligned with our financial materiality approach. So basically every time we introduce a new topic or we revisit a topic, we go through 4 different stages. First of all, we have to have a rationale for why the topic is important. Based on that, we derive an expected approach, something that we would expect from companies to have in place. The third step is kind of crucial, because in the CSA, we do not just want to have expectations, but we also want to have specific KPIs to measure the performance on different aspects. And last but not least, we have to close the circle, and we have to critically evaluate whether these kind of performance indicators and doing or performing well or bad on them can actually have an impact on a company's value drivers. So for example, growth, capital efficiency, profitability through costs, and also the company's risk profile. And with that, I'd now like to go into the details of the IT security question. And in terms of the rationale, I think it's fair to say that the increasing number of information security breaches, the relevance of IT infrastructure incidents, and of course the related costs, they have shown that cybersecurity has become a financially material issue which needs to be managed closely. So the costs are manifold. There's internal costs, operational costs related to dealing with cybercrime and incidents prevention. There's external costs, which include the consequences of cyber attacks, such as the loss and theft of sensitive information, operations disruptions, fines, penalties, infrastructure damage, and of course, revenue loss, and maybe even loss of customers. So I think it's fair to say that companies that manage these topics well, that have systems and procedures in place that ensure that let's say the infrastructure could work smoothly, there's fewer disruptions, and that are better protected against attacks, they have a competitive advantage against their peers, or compared to their peers. Now, based on that, what kind of approach could we formulate? So this kind of follows a classic, build up of a criterion, because in a first step, we would like to see how the topic is approached from a governance perspective. So we think it's fair to expect that companies, or at least their board, or actually their board of directors and executive management, they should be directly engaged in cybersecurity. And on top of that, they should have policies, procedures in place to make all employees aware of cybersecurity threats. Apart from the policies, they should also have the relevant processes and infrastructure to prevent IT system interruptions and attacks. And they should also be able to track the number and scope of cybersecurity attacks, and last but not least, measure the financial implications of incidents. So now that we've formulated our expectations, it's about how we can actually measure these. And when we again start off with the governance aspect, we believe that we can check whether the board of directors has the relevant experience and has established clear responsibilities and committees. So it's common for companies to describe the kind of committees they have in place, the kind of responsibilities they have, what they're taking care of. So we would expect companies to have this in place for cybersecurity. On an operational level, we can check whether the company has a dedicated chief information security officer, or chief security officer, or chief technology officer, or chief information officer, and to make sure that this topic is also approached on an operational level. When it comes to the policy, we can check how comprehensive it is, whether they are conducting awareness trainings, whether companies have a defined escalation process, and last but not least, whether this also flows into employees' say performance evaluation. When we look at processes and infrastructure, we can check whether companies have a business continuity or contingency plan in place, whether they have certified their infrastructure, whether they've consulted external parties to do that, maybe even through vulnerability analysis. And last but not least, they should also have an understanding of the number of breaches, the customers affected, maybe if customers' data was affected, and the fines paid. And all this, we believe, has an effect on a company's risk profile and is therefore relevant to be assessed and to be included in the CSA. So let's now look at how companies have actually performed on this criterion. As I said, this is a criterion that we've updated. So we're going to look at that in a bit more detail. On the right-hand side in yellow, you can see the average criterion score by the regions and also worldwide for all companies that have filled in the CSA. And what we can see is that there's actually not that much difference. I'd say most regions score around 50 points, 50 out of 100, with North America slightly lagging behind. When we look at the Southeast Asian countries that for which we're assessing companies, we see that the Philippines as well as Singapore, they're more or less in line with these global averages. We have Thailand performing really well, also compared to other leading countries, and we have Malaysia that is catching up, currently scoring 31 points on average. This is just the criterion level. This criterion consists of 4 questions. We're going to look at 3 in a bit more detail, and these are the 3 that also apply to all the 61 industries. There's just to note, there's a 4th and a 5th question that investigate the number of breaches and also the IT infrastructure incidents, which are more relevant, say, for banks, utilities, and telecoms. But as this is a smaller set of industries, I'm only going to look at the first 3 questions here. And these are the governance question, security measures, and processes and infrastructure. Now, what we can see on the left-hand side is relatively representative for the criterion score. We see that the Philippines and Singapore, they score more or less in line with the world average, which shows in pink. We have Thailand that is scoring well, and we have Malaysia that's catching up. If we then go to the second question on security measures, this question looks at whether there's a policy in place, whether companies perform awareness trainings, whether they have the escalation process in place, and whether employees' performance evaluation is also taken into account cybersecurity. We see that in this area, which has, to be fair, remained unchanged since last year, companies are doing much better. So we see that in the average scores that they achieved. Also, Singapore outperforming the world average here. So given that companies are doing relatively well in this area, I'm not going to go into the details on this second question. However, I think it's worth looking at the process and infrastructure question. We see that companies struggle much more to score highly in this area. So we're going to look at how companies are doing in terms of their business continuity plans, vulnerability analysis, external certification of their IT infrastructure, etc. These are all the questions that go into this third topic here. So in terms of information security and governance, in this question, we would like to see whether the board of directors is engaged in the cybersecurity strategy, the review process, and whether and this is new, whether the responsible person actually has relevant IT information security and a cybersecurity background. So we've had a question about the board responsibility already, and now we'd like to know whether this person actually has the relevant experience, whether this is publicly available, and of course whether this person sits also in the relevant committee that has this task of defining the cybersecurity strategy. Maybe it's worthwhile to go into our definitions here of what's considered relevant experience. So relevant experience in this case is experience in the implementation of IT, information security, cybersecurity, or operational responsibility for IT as a senior executive of a company. So if you have been the sales manager of Google, this wouldn't count as relevant experience. Also, academic experience, so theoretical experience, would not be considered. And what we can see when we look at the charts, and I'm now showing this for different industries, is that across the board, there's actually very few board of directors that have officially addressed this topic. We see a bigger uptake among financial companies and utilities, also information technology companies, which also have had this question in their CSA for a longer time, so for which this topic has been relevant for a longer time. And now that we've expanded it, we see that there's still a lot of room for improvement in our view, at least from a governance perspective. What is also new on this governance aspect is that we look at the operational level. So we want to know whether companies have senior executive positions that oversee cybersecurity. And all in all, we see that this is a practice that is more adopted, so to speak, by companies. We have, say, around 30 to 40% of companies that we assess that have such positions in place. Again, financials and utilities leading the pack in this area. So we see that about 19 or 18% of companies have a chief information security officer or a chief technology officer, but still the majority actually neither has a CSO or a CTO, which we believe also offers some room for improvement to address this topic on a more strategic level. So this is about the governance aspect. There would be another question about security measures, which we're going to skip now. We're going to go into the process and infrastructure question now. And then this question starts off with analyzing whether companies have a business continuity or contingency plan and incident response procedures in place. And what we can see here is, again, that actually it's not common practice yet. There's many financial companies, about 50% or 40%, sorry, and about 40% of utilities that have such contingency plans that allow them to act quickly in case something happens, allows them to restore data, restore system availability. They have that in place, but for many other industries, it's still relatively exceptional. And what you can also see here, with indicated by the different colors, is how often these plans are being tested. So having a plan is one thing, but testing it is absolutely crucial in this area, as you want to make sure that in case something happens, these plans also work out. And our best practice here would be to test these plans at least semi-annually. We see that only about say 5 to 10% of companies in the utilities and financial industry actually do this. An aspect that has been revised this year is about vulnerability analysis and simulated hacker attacks. What is this? Basically, it's a kind of analysis that allows a company to define, identify, and also prioritize vulnerabilities in their computer systems, applications, or in their network infrastructure. So it provides the organization with the necessary knowledge and awareness and the risk background to understand the threats to its environment, and also to react appropriately. So it's and the picture that we see here is relatively similar. We have about 40% of financials that actually make use of this kind of analysis, which can also be referred to as penetration tests, for example. But overall, we see that 75% of companies actually do not perform such an analysis, and we believe that this would be this would be highly beneficial for companies to better understand where their vulnerabilities are and to act appropriately. And I think with that, I'd like to close this information security criterion. As we've seen, and this is not unusual, whenever we say expand a criterion or make it applicable to more industries, we see that many companies struggle in the beginning. They don't have that in place, and that's also one way of how the CSA can deliver value to your company. You can kick off, or you can initiate a discussion about these topics if you haven't done so yet, and maybe put that also in the public domain, as there's investor interest in these kind of topics, and the global investment community would like to know how their companies are actually addressing these kind of issues. And with that, I'd like to move to the other criterion that I'd like to discuss, packaging. As I mentioned, this is a criterion that doesn't apply to all industries. We have it included in the questionnaire, of course, for food and food producers, beverage producers, restaurants, hoteling companies, but also airlines, casinos, personal products and household products producers. So these kind of industries are, of course, affected by packaging issues. But I think also as consumer, all of us can basically relate to this. And therefore I think it makes sense to look at this topic in a more detail, also given that we've revised this in the CSA 2020. So what's the rationale for including packaging in the CSA? Waste generated and, of course, resources used for packaging, they're increasingly important for many stakeholders. They can present both a risk, so for example, in terms of regulatory or legal risks, and opportunities for companies in a sense that packaging increasingly is becoming a selling argument for consumers. So companies with packaging strategies, including environmental considerations and risk factors related to unsustainable packaging practices, companies with the ability to monitor the amounts of different packaging have a competitive advantage over their peers. So what can we expect from companies in this area? First of all, we would expect companies to have a group-wide commitment and associated programs in place to address and improve packaging solutions. That's always the first step. It's again looking at, how is it addressed from a governance perspective. In a second step, we want to see we would expect companies to have detailed monitoring in place of, for example, the amounts of packaging material used. And of course, once they started measuring, we would like to see targets, and of course that companies are following up on these targets. How does this translate into measurable performance indicators? Well, for a group-wide commitment, we can look at transparency as a first step. Are these commitments publicly available? And if they are, how comprehensive are they? Do they have programs in place to increase the use of reusable, recyclable, and recycled materials or not? Do these companies also commit to allocate research and development resources to these developments and to improve on their packaging? What about the coverage? Is this coverage of monitoring? So what about the coverage of monitoring? Is that in place? Does it cover the different, say, materials? Does a company have an idea of the total weight for each kind of category? So for example, wood, paper fiber, glass, metal, plastic, can they measure it? And do they have an understanding of the percentage of recycled or at least certified material used in their packaging? And last but not least, are they establishing ambitious targets that are not just basically greenwashing? And all of that translates into the value drivers through a risk profile. Packaging can be a substantial part of a company's footprint, and there are discussions ongoing, particularly in the area of plastic, to say increase regulatory scrutiny. And of course, packaging is part of a company's cost structure, so it does impact profitability in the end, and therefore the company's value. So let's now look at how companies have been doing in this area in terms of average score. And because there's fewer industries, I'm now only showing the regions here, and this bar charts here are showing the average score from participating companies. What we can see is that the topic is say a bit more advanced in Europe, where we have a higher average score. Asia Pacific more or less in line with the world average, and we see that in America, and particularly in North America, companies are lagging behind. But how does that look like on a question level? So this criterion has 3 questions. The first one is looking at the packaging commitment, and we can see that on the left-hand side. And then the second questions, and the second and the third question, are looking at the coverage of the monitoring and whether targets have been set, to put it briefly. So what we can see is that in the packaging commitments question, companies are doing best. This is kind of natural. I have to say that we've had this packaging commitment question in place already before. However, this year it was revised, and we are now able to distinguish between the different kinds of levels of commitment in a much better way than before. But nevertheless, companies are still doing well in this area, in particularly in Europe, and again, Latin America, North America slightly lagging behind, and Asia Pacific more or less on par with the world average. When we go further to the right, we see that when it actually comes to measuring the packaging materials, the different categories, when it comes to setting targets and reporting on these publicly, we see that this is still an area that can see some improvement, in particular for plastic. But basically the general pattern that we see with European companies addressing this to a bigger extent, it still holds also for the other questions. And we also see that Asia Pacific is still more or less on par or even outperforming the world average. So let's look at at all these questions in a bit more detail. And let's start off with the packaging commitment question. So here we see, or what we're asking here is whether in their group-wide commitments, companies are addressing the respective environmental aspects in their packaging strategies. And you see two numbers here. I've put the average from the world and the average from the Asia Pacific region for you to as a little reference. What is positive is that there's many companies, about a third of companies that have programs to phase out single-use plastic, something that we only introduced this year, but it seems that this is already, say, well adopted. And also, there is a widespread commitment to increase recyclable packaging in general. Maybe to quickly talk about the comparison world versus Asia Pacific, we see that the pattern is also relatively consistent with the companies from the region scoring about 5 to 10% lower, or basically 5 to 10% less companies have these relevant aspects covered in their group-wide commitment. If we go to the right-hand side, we see that there's other aspects that are, say, less likely to be covered by companies. These are aspects relating to increasing the recycled material in the packaging and to reduce the packaging as a whole. And I'm a bit, I find it a bit ashamed that actually this last aspect that I just mentioned only comes up or only ranks fourth, because I strongly believe that we won't be able to solve the packaging issue as a whole without reducing the absolute amount of packaging. So I do hope that companies realize and put more emphasis on this fourth aspect here. And now I'd like to talk about the two aspects that are covered less often, and I think they're quite interesting aspects. One is the programs to ensure that packaging is actually recycled. And of course, if you take a step back and look at this issue as a whole, of course, it's quite relevant whether all the, say, the recyclable packaging is actually recycled. And we see that many companies start to draw the boundaries of their responsibilities in this kind of area, and this is also the reason for say quite engaged discussions about where corporate responsibility stops. And I'm sure we'll see a lot of developments in these areas going further. A part or an aspect that has been covered even less frequently is the allocation of research and development resources. So it seems like companies or many companies are hoping to have or to rely on an external solution for their packaging strategies. So this is it about the general commitment. I'd now like to go into the other questions in a bit more detail. The second question looks at packaging materials in terms of wood or paper, fiber, metal, and glass. And in a first aspect, or in a first step, we would like to understand the percentage, or we would like to understand from companies whether they're able to measure the packaging materials used throughout their operations. And for that, I'd like you to focus on the pie charts on the left. We see that a bit more than a quarter of companies is actually measuring the amount of packaging that they're using. And of that 27%, we see that about half is actually reporting on the packaging used publicly. The other half is aware of it, is measuring it, but has not yet disclosed any information about this. In a second step, it's not just about measuring and being aware of how much packaging is used for each of these categories. Is also to understand whether companies are aware of the recycled materials in their packaging, or at least what's certified. So for example, in terms of wood, FSC wood that's used in their packaging. And here we see that it's less common to know about these, say, different kinds of packaging materials, and only a minority of companies actually have a target in place, say, to increase the amount of recycled packaging material, and only a very small subset of companies have a target of 100%. And we do believe that this will be more common going forward, and I believe that there's still a lot of room, say, to differentiate from a corporate perspective on these kind of aspects. Similarly to this packaging materials question, for wood, paper fiber, metal, and glass, we're looking at plastic packaging, but we've dedicated a separate section to this, as we believe it deserves some more attention, given the controversies that have come up and that are still ongoing regarding this material. The structure is relatively similar to the other question. So in the first step, we would like to understand whether they were actually measuring the amount of plastic used in their packaging. And we see that the numbers are indeed exactly the same when it comes to this. And I would say it's also about the same when it comes to publicly reporting on plastic used in their packaging. When it comes to the subsets or basically the subcategories of plastic packaging, we're differentiating between compostable packaging, recyclable packaging, and recycled content. This is just to show how you can differentiate between the different kinds of plastic packaging, and how many different ways they are to say make this sort or this kind of packaging more sustainable. So similarly to the other packaging materials question, we see that there's only a subset of companies that has a target for each of these subcategories, and only very few have a target that is 100%. We see that in recyclable packaging. So that's at least a positive note on that one. But at the same time, same as for the other question, there's a lot of improvement potential. We do expect companies to take action in this area. And with this question, I think we have a good approach to be able to differentiate between the companies that are actually taking action and those that are, say, relying on business as usual. I do expect that there might be some questions on this. I'm happy to address them at the end of this section, but I would also like to refer you to upcoming webcasts that we have on our methodology development. On February 2nd, we have a dedicated webcast about living wage, including SAM representatives and also external experts on this topic. Also in February, we'll have another session on sustainable finance, a criterion specifically dedicated to the financial industry, banks, insurance companies, diversified financials, as this is a core criterion and is, say, much more relevant than, say, the amount of paper they use for printing. So this topic is definitely worthwhile to analyze in a bit more depth. In March, we have a webcast on gender equality and I was just talking about this, plastic packaging. The exact date is still to be announced, but there we will also have the topic experts talk about this and how we've changed our approach this year. You can register for these webcasts. I've shared the link here below. Also, please be on the lookout for all these, for the mailings, and then so that you don't miss them. In case you're more of a reader, we also have a document that summarized all these scoring and methodology changes. This is publicly available. You can access it by clicking on this link. I think the slides will be shared afterwards. Or you can also, of course, access this kind of document directly from the CSA portal.
Thanks again, Sebastian, for the introduction and the deep dive into these two questions. After this more specific deep dive, we're going to look at the benefits of participating in the CSA, which is a more overview of why it is interesting for the external, for the other stakeholders where you're collaborating, where you're talking with, why they are so interested in this, and how you can communicate with them better, how you can understand your score and how you can communicate with them. And then afterwards, I will hand over to Eric Cristianto for the ESG evaluation. And then at the end, we will answer some questions in the Q&A, and I will already answer some questions during this part of the presentation, by the way. So again, what is the value for your CSA participation for internal gap analysis and external exposure? And you can already see all the companies that use participation in the Dow Jones Sustainability Index in their communication, if they're included or if they're not included, and they have quite a high score. So there's a lot of buzz around the Dow Jones Sustainability Index. And what are companies telling about their use of the CSA? They say things like the CSA helps you to reduce sustainability risk for the companies and realize opportunities. So it's not only about just reporting. It supports a sustainable business strategy. It helps embed sustainability thinking in the corporate DNA. So it's not only external communication, it's also internal communication, not only external recognition, but also internal recognition. And what a lot of companies use it for, of course, is to communicate with sustainability focused investors and convincing them in a credible way by using an established framework like the CSA, with a company like S&P Global that is widely recognized, of course. How do you learn from your CSA? We already talked about that in the beginning. But there's a lot of other ways to learn just by not only by comparing yourself against your peers, but how do you do that in practice? You do that through the benchmarking platform that we're having. The questionnaire is filled out on an online portal that guides you through the whole assessment, which makes it easy to understand what we're asking. It gives additional guidance, it gives additional explanation, it explains why we're asking questions, for example. And then afterwards, once you have a score, you can go in and you can go into the benchmarking tab and start comparing yourself on total level, dimension level, criteria level, even question level. You can compare your score, your ranking with your peers, with your industry, how you evolved over time. We have a year-over-year changes that are nicely highlighted if they're green or if they're red. So if they're increasing or decreasing. We also give some visual support in assessing how well you're scoring. So for example, this is in the criterion governance, this is in the dimension governance and economics, where you can see your 4-year score compared to your industry peers. And if you're scoring into the top quartile, or if you're dropping to the second quartile, if you're above the average or the median, and you can also immediately see your rank, your absolute score, and then the companies around you. If you're in the top 10, you see all 10 companies. If you're a bit lower ranked, then you can see the top 5 companies and your 4 closest competitors. So a really great interactive way to see for your company specifically how you are ranked compared to your industry peers and how you have evolved over time. Again, this industry peer comparison is important because the methodology is different for every industry. We have 61 industry-specific approaches. The industry-specific approaches are based on the GICS classification. That was already a question that somebody asked. We use the standardized GICS classification for our 61 industries, and that ranges from mining and minerals, for example, to restaurants, pharmaceuticals, banking, diversified financials. So even within the financial industry, there are some sub-industries that you can see there. And it also means that for each industry, the weighting of the dimensions and the questions is different, and we have specific specific questions or specific criteria that we're asking in each industry-specific questionnaire. If you look at metals, mining, and minerals, the dimensions are fairly evenly distributed, but there are some additional questions on mineral waste management, water-related risk, biodiversity, or those are more heavily weighted. If you look at restaurants, the environmental dimension becomes already a bit smaller, but there is a question on raw material sourcing. If you look at pharmaceuticals, there the environmental dimension is very small because governance and economic dimension is much more important on an ESG level. That's according to our materiality assessment that we did. And there are questions that go into innovation management or product quality and recall management. So a very industry-specific approach. This also means that the way you compare yourself, you always have to take into consideration if you use your absolute score, it is industry specific. If you use your rank, it is also industry specific, but it's a bit more comparable already. Because if you're the first company in one industry and the other one is the first company in their industry, then you're both the best company performing within your industry, of course. So that's already a bit more comparable. And I will go a bit more into detail in a few slides from here. As mentioned, since this year, we also share question level scores. You can download the scorecard in Excel that gives you also question level insights. This is new from this year. A lot of companies have been asking about it. Also, the investor community is more and more interested in this. And we believe it's a big tool to understand how you're scoring or why you're scoring in a certain way. It's a big help for you. Apart from the actual scores, question level scores you're getting, again, just a score from 0 to 100, I can also go into a bit more detail on how you are scored in our assessment. We have different scoring approaches. Our assessment is not just a tick box exercise, yes or no, binary yes or no question, like yes, we have a policy, no, we don't have a human rights policy. It goes much deeper, it's more granular. As you remember, there's 1,000 data points that we're collecting, and we're scoring them in a lot of different ways. Of course, the first step is mostly disclosure and transparency. Do you have the data? Can you show us you're tracking this information? Can you give us supporting documents on it? That's also, you get additional score for that. And are these documents publicly available? For a lot of questions, as we saw in the transparency part of this presentation, if you have publicly available documents, that is required, or you get additional credit for that. So that's also a way we score. We ask for exposure and coverage, how much of the data covers your whole company. If we are looking for quantitative data, we also score on trend and performance. And I will give you an example of that. Then there's awareness. Are you aware of the internal and external issues or measures that are being taken? And then lastly, we ourselves do not do third-party verification, but we do give credit if you have third-party verification for data in certain questions. As an example, 3 examples of 3 questions from lower to more increasing complexity of scoring. The first one is code of business conduct, the coverage. So we are looking to the coverage of your code of business conduct. Does it cover only employees or does it also cover contractors, suppliers, service providers, subsidiaries, and even joint ventures? And what kind of coverage do we want? Do we just want the coverage of the policy itself? Do you also have written digital acknowledgements of the coverage? And do you provide trainings? And these 12 data points, they all contribute to this question score. And in this case, it is about disclosure. So we want to see if you have it. And it's not per se too much about performance. So the high number is not always important. It's the fact that you can already generate the numbers will give you a score in this question. The next question is the human rights commitment question. So we have a criterion on human rights. We have a specific question on the commitment itself. And this again goes into the granularity. We're not only asking, do you have a human rights policy? We're checking that human rights policy on how strong it is. Do you have a statement of commitment to respect human rights in accordance with internationally accepted standards? That's the first part. Then is it it's a requirement for your own operations, for your suppliers and your partners, and you have actions and procedures to undertake to meet this commitment. These 5 aspects are scored, but we need publicly available information for this data. So it is scored on the fact that we require publicly available information, and the 5 data points contribute to the question score. And then to the most complex scored question, I always like this because this shows the how well developed our methodology is. We have the question direct greenhouse gas emissions. This is direct greenhouse gas emissions. We also have one for indirect greenhouse gas emissions. And you have to provide a lot of information. You have to provide 4 years of CO2 emissions and the coverage of that data. You have to provide a target, and you have to say if this is publicly reported, this information, and if it's third-party verified. And we score you on all of this information. So to start, we score you on the coverage. Is the coverage high enough? If you only have your data for 10% of the companies in your portfolio or in your company, you won't get a high score. We score you on the trend of the 4 years of data, the normalized data. We normalize over denominator, which is mostly revenues. And we also score you on the performance of your last year's data compared to your industry. If you're in the top quintile, you get additional credit for that. Then if you have a target, we score you on the performance against that target, but we also score you on the actual setting of the target. So the target has to be credible, and it has to be credible and ambitious. So it's not good enough to just say the target is exactly the same as last year. That's not good enough, of course. And then we also score you on if it's publicly available. In this case, it has to be publicly available. So you have to provide that information, but also if it's third-party verified, that will also add to your score. As I mentioned, the transparency, and all these 11 data points contribute to the question score. So as you can see, a very developed methodology that is going much deeper than just, yes, we have it, or no, we don't. If you want to get deeper insights in this, we already provide this benchmarking database, the standard version for free. You can get your question scores for free. So you can already understand the question a lot. If you want to go really deeper, we support you with some ESG benchmarking tools where you have, for example, a company benchmarking report that gives more details on your peer comparison, on your dimension scores, but also on specific questions, gaps that you have where you can increase your total score with specific points. So if you close certain gaps, you can increase your total score with 9.1 points. So that's all additional information that we're giving, and a question gap analysis where for each aspect of a question, we can tell you this was accepted, this wasn't accepted. So if we look at the trend, we can tell you the trend was not accepted. If we look at the coverage, we tell you the coverage was not accepted. So a very detailed explanation. And we can give you a lot of leading practices examples with leading practice database, for example. I invite you to go look at the ESG benchmarking services that we offer. Apart from these services that we offer, I want to give you some tips and tricks, as Rajesh mentioned, some best practices for completing the CSA in 2021. Three things: data quality. It is important to read the information text and the question text and follow the given definitions. We see often that companies answer besides the question. Our questions are very specific because they are challenging companies to take the to be the best, have the best possible strategies, to have the best possible performance. So we ask for specific aspects, also answer with these specific aspects. If you're in doubt, contact the CSA helpline. That's a free service. You can always contact them to ask for any clarification. Be aware of your supporting references and comments. More documents and longer comments do not equal a higher score. Supporting references and comments are for us to understand the question better, but it's only when there's some additional information that is not covered in the question itself that is relevant that you should answer it there. Avoid spending too much time yourself on gathering all this information if it's not related to the question. Additionally, respect the assessment time frame. If we need the document before the closing of the questionnaire, we cannot accept it afterwards anymore because we are starting the assessment almost immediately. And then again, for non-English documents, the official language of the CSA is English. All our analysts are are using English, but we do understand that some documents are in another native language. Translations are acceptable in this case. If this relevant paragraph is translated, that is more than good enough. Then the value of the CSA, and this will help you understand how you can communicate also better. Numbers are not enough to explain market value, and that is really the reason why we are doing this whole exercise. There's a lot of other indications. There's governance and compliance, there's reputation and ethics, there's intellectual capital, the license to operate. Those are all non-financial numbers, non-financial indicators that also explain market value. And we see that this has shifted over the years. If we look at the components of the S&P 500 market value in 1975, that was mostly defined based on financial or tangible assets, which were mostly expressed in financial metrics. We see more and more that intangible assets are becoming more and more important. And you can see that where you have codes of conduct and compliance, corruption and bribery, corporate governance, risk and crisis management. Those are really intangible assets that we are assessing. These intangible aspects of a company's sustainability performance need to be made tangible and visible towards the stakeholders. And that is the role that the corporate sustainability assessment performs. We are asking you for this non-financial information, and we are translating this into scores and ranking so that the investor community understands how well you're performing and that they can use it. And they want to use it. We see that the number of ESG considerations, for example, in funds, that exploded in 2019. The flows into funds, the assets under management into funds that increased a lot. So we see a huge uptake in investor interest. if you look at the UN PRI's framework, the breakdown again shows an increasing growth into signatories for the UN PRI and into the assets under management there. Also, if you look at the type of financial products it's integrated in, it's not only listed equity anymore, it also goes into fixed income, into private markets, into other aspects. The uptake into new signatories has also come from Asia, so it's not only a European, it's also not only European, although there the interest is strongest with European investors, but also in Asia, it's picking up. And we don't only see it in the funds or the companies that sign UNPRI pledges, for example. We also asked, or this Edelman Trust, the company asked, that's a research company, they asked investors which kind of ESG ratings they are using in their investment decision and valuation criteria at this moment already. And 98% of investors are already using an ESG rating. And S&P SAM, the S&P or the Robeco SAM, they asked about Robeco SAM, but that's now with S&P, is one of these top-rated ESG frameworks, ESG ratings that investors are already using. You see it also in when they were asked about the usefulness of ESG disclosure frameworks. You see the standard frameworks like GRI, TCFD, SASB, or something that the World Economic Forum brought out. But the Dow Jones Sustainability Index is also considered a framework for a lot of companies, and again there S&P pops up as a very useful or somewhat useful framework to be used. And this is about the frameworks and the usage of the frameworks. We also asked about which ESG rating was considered of the highest quality, and this was an unprompted question. So we just asked, which do you consider the highest quality, without giving names. And companies were talking that the SAM corporate sustainability assessment came on top of respondents who listed us as being of the highest quality. So that was a really nice result that we see. And it again underscores that the investor community is really interested in this ESG information. You can also see that in all the indices that came out that are incorporating the CSA data. It's not only the DJSI, it's also the S&P 500 ESG, but also the S&P Europe 350 ESG index, for example. So there's a lot of indices that are incorporating CSA data. As Sebastian mentioned, we are also sharing this on the S&P Global ESG Market Intelligence platform, where the investors can look and compare your scores in the different dimensions, into the different criteria on the historical performance. So they can immediately see your information, dive into it, understand it, and use it in their decision making, or reaching out to you to ask about it, of course. And then we start to talk about how you communicate your CSA performance. There are different, we already mentioned that there are different CSA scores. You have your absolute score, which is what we call the score, and then you have your ranking, your percentile ranking, or your actual rank. And they have different characteristics. Somebody asked it already in the Q&A. They show different performances. The absolute score is independent from your peers. That is a score against our expectation, or the CSA expectation. The percentile or the rank, that is independent from methodology changes. Every year we change it, but it changes for all companies. So therefore the rank, the score of all companies is influenced, and the rank normally stays the same. The absolute score, there is no comparison with peers. Of course, that's why you need a rank or a percentile rank. And again, that is impacted by methodology changes. If you look at the percentile rank, That is again impacted by peer score. So you can have the same absolute score, but if your peers perform better, then your ranking goes down, of course. And it is also impacted by the number of peers. If more companies start participating, your rank might go up or down. There is limited comparability across different industries for both. Total dimension and criterion scores are indeed influenced differently, depending on the industry you're in. And now I'm going to show some examples of companies communicating on these score or rank and on different levels of their performance, total dimension criterion, for example. And that gives you an indication that you can really be creative, or that you can give a lot of insight if you communicate this way. This, for example, companies that communicate on total score and percentile rank, where we have it is both from this year and from last year, where companies talk about inclusion in the DJSI, but also about improving 7 places in relation to 2019. So it talks about improvement. Companies also share their absolute score, which is logical because the investor community can also see your absolute score. And they also talk about their ranking in the environmental. They also talk about, for example, ranking in dimensions already. This is another, this is a more specific example about dimension ranking, where a company, Société Générale, for example, they highlight the fact that they are ranked first in the environmental dimension and 6th overall. We always say that if you do this, you should also refer to the total scorecard, refer to your total ranking, to not do greenwashing and just highlight a few. So it's nice to highlight a few, but also cover your total score, of course. But you can, just like UPL Limited, you can also explain that you're ranked 23rd, but that you're scoring above industry averages in all dimensions. That are other ways of highlighting specific good performances. And you can even communicate on criterion scores. This company, Manpower Group, talks about their DJSI inclusion and about achieving top scores, absolute scores in different criteria. Again, that they emphasize. The same for UPL Limited. What might be more difficult to talk about is when you have a ranking drop. It is not always highlighting your top scoring performance, but sometimes there's also drops in ranking. How do you communicate on that? A very nice example that we saw this year was from Allianz. They were industry leader for the last few years, and they dropped. They were not industry leader anymore. They were overtaken by 2 other companies, and their CEO made that news publicly, and I think he handled it really well. He emphasized again that it's a shared striving to improve the industry's performance on ESG, and he even congratulated his peers. So this is a very positive way of communicating and also highlighting that you were actually doing already quite well. And then the most enthusiastic communication on score improvement that we saw over the last few years, and I always want to share this one, is this company, this person that was so enthusiastic about his score improvement. It is in Spanish, but I translated it. He literally said, "I did not make this up. 12 damn points increase, and again in the Mila index," and then with some very nice emoticons showing their score improvement year over year. And this is to highlight how you can communicate your score, how you can understand your score, why it's important, and how you communicate it. And this is also the introduction to the next speaker, Eric Cristianto, who will talk about ESG evaluation, which is a great tool to take this communication towards the investor community one step further. And with no further ado, Eric, to you.
So what I'm describing earlier was about how our analysts have actually incorporated various parts of their expertise in different credit rating into the ESG valuation product and other sustainable finance product that ratings have. Now, just to describe a little bit about our capability, the ratings division do have our credit rating analysts, so about 1,500 of them globally. And we also have a dedicated team of sustainable finance analysts, including based out of Singapore. So we have our head of sustainable finance analyst, Bertrand Jabuli, based in Singapore, and his team as well. So really, the expertise that we have is also based out of Singapore as well. So going into the product ESG evaluation, what is it all about? So we really take advantage of our close relationship with the capital market. So we listen to the market, we listen to the investors, the bankers, and intermediaries to understand what they want to see from an ESG rating of a company. So we call it ESG evaluation. Essentially, it's a rating on a layman term. It is a cross-sector relative analysis of a company's ESG profile and its forward-looking risk mitigation capability that takes into account material ESG factors. And when I mention materiality, it's material to the financial impact of the entity. So earlier in the Q&A, I saw one of the questions that mentioned about in the CSA, you look at the scoring across within a sector itself. And so how different is the ESG evaluation? For ESG evaluation, we look at the scoring across different sectors. And I will explain a little bit about how we are able to achieve that. And again, leveraging on the CSA that many of you have completed. So the ESG evaluation is broadly separated into two main features. One is the ESG profile, where we look at your performance, your current and historical data. So things like your greenhouse gas emissions that you report to the CSA, your safety record that you report to the CSA, governance, so on and so forth. Those are the information that flows into our ESG profile. Now, in addition to that, we have our analysts. So in the previous slide, you see the sustainable finance analyst and a credit analyst that will engage with your management, including your board member, to have what we call as a preparedness meeting. So in this meeting, you have your analysts sitting down with your management to discuss about the corporate policies around ESG, to think about what is the entities, the organization's plan about mitigating ESG risks that are increasingly coming up. And we'll have discussions about your preparedness against physical risk, for example. And in this today's situation, it will not be a surprise if questions around social impact, questions around management of pandemic will come into picture as well. And these two components combined will derive an ESG evaluation. An ESG evaluation is a score as well as a report. So it's a standard 12-page report, which I will show you in a little bit, that describe the analysis. So not only are you getting the score, you also have our analytical opinion on what is the strength and weaknesses of your company, of your performance, as well as different components of ESG preparedness that we are looking at. Now, this is a sample report of a client that have made their ESG evaluation public, Next Era Energy, one of the listed company. This is a snapshot of the 3-page of the entire report. You can see on the left-hand side, there's a summary of the ESG profile. So the company gets a score of 72. In the preparedness element, it receives an ordinal scale of best in class. And eventually, this totals up to give you an ESG evaluation of 86. So you see that the preparedness component here do give you additional benefit score to your final ESG evaluation. Now, the subsequent 2 snapshots actually just highlight what are the sub-criteria that we look at under each of the components for ESG profile as well as preparedness opinion. Now, this is where the CSA comes into the picture, and they play a big part in this. Lim and Sebastian has gone in great detail about how in-depth and how extensive the CSA goes into gathering information from you. So what we do is we take on the information that you have provided with your permission, of course. If you decide to engage with the ratings analyst on an ESG evaluation, you'll give us permission to access your CSA information. And then we will apply what we call as the risk atlas to normalize the different key sustainability factors that apply to different sectors, different regions. So we have a risk atlas that we apply to give to normalize the score, basically, that you get from our analysis. Now, once the profile analysis is complete, we'll go into the preparedness meeting where our analyst and your board representative will have a discussion about policies of the company, preparedness to future risk. And there will be an adjustment session where we will present the findings that we have for you to give feedback on before we finalize the ESG evaluation. Now, the ESG evaluation can be made confidential so that you can use it for your own benchmarking purposes to understand where you can improve or where you are doing really good at. Or you can also make it publicly available for investors, or increasingly for use in your sustainability linked financing, which I will talk about later. Now, one benefit in working with S&P today is that many of you might be our credit rating client already. So you may already engage with our credit analyst to get your credit rating. Now, if you are already a client, these two exercises can be combined. So the primary analyst that is already doing your credit rating will still be the liaison for you to be doing the ESG evaluation. They will be supported by our sustainable finance analysts, of course, because they are the center of excellence. They are basically the brain of the sustainable finance analysis, and they will supply the information through to the primary analyst, whom your management team is already very familiar with to deliver the ESG evaluation. So these combine, the expertise of our primary analysts as well as the use of the CSA really shorten the entire ESG evaluation process. In the past, it will take at least 12 weeks to get an ESG evaluation done. With the CSA now fully incorporated into our ESG evaluation exercise, it will take as short as 4 to 6 weeks to get it done. So really accelerating the entire process of you getting the ESG evaluation and for you to use it for financing purposes or reporting to your investors. Now, this is just a snapshot of the score and how it looks like. I'm aware that I only have about 5 minutes left for Q&A as well as clearing the slides. So maybe I'll just zoom through these slides, which I believe will be made available to you anyway. So if you have further questions on the details, I'm more than happy to take it on offline. There are a couple of slides that I'd like to highlight. So one of them is the use case of the ESG evaluation in sustainability linked loans or sustainability linked financing. Why I want to highlight this, because many of you may be aware that the MAS has recently announced the GSLS, or the Green and Sustainability Linked Loan Scheme, where you will get an incentive or a rebate basically on the cost of you in issuing sustainability linked loans. Now, MásMóvil here, a Spanish telco in Europe, was one of the first companies to issue sustainability linked financing. And we are very happy that they were able to use the report that we produced for them, the ESG evaluation score, and they work with JP Morgan and BNP Paribas to tie the interest rate to the score that we provide. And I think the acceptance by the banks and the financial institutions into our ESG evaluation do give us a little bit of comfort that it's credible and it's robust enough to rely on this assessment to determine your cost of capital, essentially. I also want to highlight to you the use case of ESG evaluation for investors. So American Water Works, for example, they have clearly identified ESG evaluation as one of the reasons, amongst a few, that help them to basically oversell their debt offering. So their long-term debt offering was more than 10 times oversubscribed, and part of that is because of the ESG evaluation that they did with us. And these reports are publicly available. So if you want to Google them and download the report, you can get it from our S&P Global Ratings website as well. Just a couple more slides. This is a couple of notes that investors have given to us. They've given us the thumbs up, essentially, to say that ESG evaluation is something that they're looking for. So not only are investors looking at score right now with company, they also want to have qualitative opinion or analysis from that are provided by our ESG experts, and that's where ESG evaluation comes in. So again, various different investor groups are giving us this support, from asset managers like Loomis Sales and PineBridge Investments to insurance firm like Liberty Mutual. So again, very forthcoming support to the ESG evaluation. Now, my last slide, I just want to highlight a couple of takeaways on the ESG evaluation, just to highlight 3 of them. First of all, The ESG evaluation is a forward-looking, long-term assessment of the company's readiness to manage ESG risk. We engage directly with the management of the company so that you can provide confidential information, you can provide context to your performance so far to our analysts in a confidential setting, so that we can take into account all this information to derive a final analysis. Last but not least, which I've not mentioned a lot, is that we also take into account your TCFD assessment, and which we will opine on as well. So many companies in this part of the world, in ASEAN in particular, are starting to take on TCFD as part of the disclosures. As part of ESG evaluation, our analysts will also opine on your alignment to TCFD as well. So with that, I will now pass the time back to Rajesh, I believe, who will help us to moderate the Q&A. Thanks, Rajesh.
Thank you, Eric. So thank you all, actually, Sebastian, Lim, and Eric. Now, we have just 1 minute left. So, I know both of you have answered many questions, Sebastian and Lim, in the backend. So thank you for that. Would you like to pick any specific question, Lim or Sebastian, that you marked that you want to take it live?
I want to take at least or just one question. It's a general question, but very interesting.
Go ahead.
The question was, what is the difference between the CSA and the other ratings in the market? And I just want to highlight that again. As you saw, the CSA goes into a lot of detail. It's a very comprehensive assessment. It covers all aspects of ESG. Additionally to that, it is not a AI-driven assessment where it's just a tick box yes or no. There's actual human analysts that assess your answer and that give you a score that's different. And then one of the biggest aspects is that it's an active participation where you are involved in. So it's not only scraping publicly available information where there might be issues or where you are losing a lot of information that is really interesting to give an ESG score. We also take non-public information into account by the fact that you're actively participating. So comprehensive, there's a human aspect, there's a lot of analysts looking at it, and it takes non-publicly available information into account. I just want to highlight that.
Thank you, Lim. And maybe to add to that, I think now that we're part of S&P, it's also worth mentioning that S&P is actually uniquely positioned not to just serve capital markets that have always been served, but also corporates through our different divisions. Eric made a very good example of how the ratings division is basically taking the CSA to the next level. But as you all know, we have an index division that is creating more and more financial indices that rely on the CSA information. We have the market intelligence division that is making all these ESG scores and data available to the broader investment community. So I think the reach of what we have and the position in which we are is really unmatched, and I think that makes a lot of, and that's what brings a lot of value to companies and also to investors that rely on this information.
Okay, thank you, Sebastian. I saw you marked a couple of questions, so you would like to address the question related to translations?
Sure. Yeah. So Lim mentioned that the official language of the assessment is English. We fully understand that not all of your documentation is in English, as you might be coming from non-English speaking countries. That is fine. If you have a document that is relevant for a specific section, it's completely sufficient to just translate the relevant aspect, the relevant paragraph. You do not have to have the whole document or report translated.
Okay, so we are up, Sebastian, but still there is this last one. I think that's interesting. If you can answer this. For scoring on performance trends, is there an upper limit on how much performance can be improved?
So this is for example, relating to operational eco-efficiency questions or other questions where we look for specific data points to see how they have evolved over time. Our methodology takes into account several aspects, and usually, say, the amount of points that you can get for a certain aspect, for example, the trend, is limited depending on the question to about 20 or 30%, and the rest of the points have to be earned by, for example, being more transparent about it, by having third-party verification and setting targets.
All right. So thank you. I think we have to stop here because our time is up. So once again, I want to thank everyone who is watching us today and spend these 2 hours with us. I know most of you have signed up for tomorrow's main summit, which is the 4th Asia Sustainability Reporting Summit. So I look forward to seeing all of you there tomorrow at the summit. And my very special thanks to Sebastian, you, and Lim. You have woken up early, and you have been working very hard with this one, and I'm sure it was very useful for everyone who are watching. And Eric, I think we need to do another session with you so that we can talk in more detail about your exciting product. So thank you, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your day, and we will see you tomorrow. So bye for now.